Are you thinking about launching a podcast? If you aren't sure where to start, which mic to choose, or what the process looks like, then you are in the right place. Because today I am so excited to share my complete podcast launch system to help you launch your podcast on Apple and Spotify and get your first 1,000 downloads. And stick around until the end, because I'll include a few bonus tips to help you find more listeners and to monetize your podcast even if you have a small audience. Hey, I'm Melissa, the founder of Wit and Wire, where I help creators turn their skills and passions into profitable online businesses. I'm the host of the Wit and Wire podcast and Booksmart, and the creator of Everything is Teachable, which Apple featured under Best New Career Podcasts in the United States. More importantly, I've helped thousands of podcasting students through Wit and Wire's online programs, and I can't wait to help you start podcasting by answering these key questions. Number 1, what should your podcast be about? Number 2, what equipment do you need, like microphones and recording tools, including remote recording options? And number 3, how do you actually launch a podcast on Apple and Spotify, and what crucial tools will you need to record, edit, publish, and market your new show? Let's start with step 1, your strategic concept. You probably have a general sense of your podcast category, like parenting, comedy, or digital marketing. But a category is not the same thing as a topic. And in order to stand out in an increasingly crowded marketplace, you have to make sure that your concept is both memorable and specific. A lot of new podcast hosts worry that getting too niche means you'll limit your growth potential. In fact, I want to shift your mindset a little bit because the opposite is true. If you go too broad, your podcast won't appeal to anyone. Plus, it makes your podcast very hard to recommend. And since every successful podcast host I know credits word of mouth as a major factor in their growth, we have to make sure that anyone can easily explain what your podcast is about and who should tune in. To help you make sure you have a clear strategic podcast concept, I'm going to teach you how to write what I call your winning podcast formula. This is a lesson from my Wit and Wire course, the Podcast Launch Accelerator, and it breaks down into these 3 parts. So the sentence reads, "This is a podcast about a topic to help some ideal listener have some kind of benefit." Now, when I ask most people, what's your podcast about? They'll only give me the first line. They'll say, oh, it's a podcast about parenting or productivity. But choosing an ideal listener, let's say for the productivity podcast, changes the way you would approach every episode. Productivity for parents, engineers, virtual assistants, who is this for? Or with a parenting podcast, how old are the kids? Is it for single parents versus a double income household? You can start to see how getting more specific about your ideal listener is so crucial because those listeners' needs are so different. And that's where the third piece of the formula comes in. There has to be a reason for people to tune in. Instead of thinking about what you want to say, ask, how is this podcast going to serve others? Do you entertain? As a business owner, are you teaching people new skills or helping them with motivation or mindset shifts? To share my own example, the Wit and Wire podcast has an umbrella topic of online business. But more specifically, it's a podcast where I explain today's top digital marketing and course creation strategies to help new and growing business owners earn more money online, but without feeling burnt out, feeling like they have to be everywhere at once. This is a clear pitch for not only what the podcast is about, but who should care and what they will get from it. Overall, the podcasts with the highest growth and profit potential are not the ones that have the broadest audience or the broadest topic. They are the ones with a clear topic, a specific listener, and your unique point of view. And P.S., I know a lot of people worry about competition, but if you see other podcasts out there with the same topic, that is a good sign. Competition validates demand. So it's actually better if you see other podcasts, blogs, or YouTube channels on a similar topic. Instead, the way to stand out is with a clear point of view. And I don't mean being the number one expert or guru in your space. Who you are, your identity, your experiences, your perspective, those are all ways that you'll stand out and become someone's go-to podcast. So I want you to know that a point of view isn't something you earn. It's something you already have right now. And I know that people will want to hear what you have to say. Step 2, choose your podcast name. When I analyze top shows on Apple and Spotify, there are 3 common naming strategies that most successful shows use. Up first, we have the eponymous name, which means it's named after you or your business. So as an example, my business is called Wit and Wire, so my podcast is called the Wit and Wire Podcast. I could have also used the Melissa Guller Show if I wanted to build brand recognition as a thought leader in my space, the creator economy. So I would recommend this strategy if you're trying to make a name for yourself, or if you want a little flexibility to evolve, because naming it after yourself does leave room as you pivot or as your interests evolve. The second popular strategy is a descriptive name, which is very straightforward and includes the topic in the title. It doesn't have to include the whole topic, but listeners should know what the podcast is about from the title alone. As an example, Harvard Business Review has a podcast called Women at Work, which barely needs an explanation. These descriptive names can be tricky because they're often taken, but they are search engine friendly. And more importantly, they are human friendly because your ideal listener should immediately know it's for her, which is huge. Lastly, we have what I call a treasure map name. This is more of a creative nod or an insider reference, and I call it a treasure map name because you're leaving a clue for listeners to uncover the full picture. So, for example, I'm a huge fan of the Bachelor franchise. I will not apologize. I've watched nearly all of it. And the quote, "I am not here to make friends," is a well-known reference in Bachelor Nation. So this podcast is called Here to Make Friends. The longer title includes a subtitle, I think, so it's Here to Make Friends, a Bachelor recap show to help with SEO. But you can start to see these 3 strategies can all work. And if you're stuck on a name, my best tip is to brainstorm a list of 20 to 30 options before you commit to your first idea. I also recommend saying it out loud and imagining yourself introducing it on your podcast or sharing it with friends, since that can help too. Once you choose a name, it's time to design your podcast artwork, aka your podcast graphic. It's the square image that represents your podcast in all major apps, and I actually created a full video about designing podcast artwork if you want to check that out above or below this video, and I share all of my tips to design eye-catching podcast artwork, even if you aren't very design savvy. And I also included notes on Apple's strict guidelines because they're very specific about what you can and cannot do. Step 3, microphones and equipment. It's time for the fun stuff. There are countless great microphones out there, but for most new podcast hosts, I recommend a USB microphone instead of what's called an XLR microphone. USB microphones have one cable that plugs directly from the mic into your computer. If you don't have a USB port on your computer, you may need an adapter, so keep that in mind. But an XLR microphone requires a different type of cable, which can't be plugged into a computer. Instead, you'll need a second piece of equipment called an audio interface, which acts as the middleman between your microphone and your computer. It looks like this. The audio interface has a few dials to adjust your microphone, but that's generally how it works. Microphone to interface, and then the interface plugs into your computer. Today, USB microphone technology has come a long way. So the reason I recommend USB mics for new podcasters is because for the audio quality, price point, and ease of use, I believe they're the best value for most users. Here are some of my top recs. On the left, the budget pick is about $50 to $60. The Blue Yeti, maybe you've seen before. I would say right now it's still the most commonly recommended microphone for new hosts, and it's the most popular, well-loved choice by Wit and Wire students because I think it's the right price point, it's easy to use, and the audio quality works. The mic you see me using in this video is the Shure MV7, and it's definitely a little more expensive. I actually did another video where I compared the Blue Yeti and the Shure MV7 side by side, so you'll find a link above or in the description if you want to check that out and hear the difference for yourself. Then on the far right, we've got the top of the line Shure SM7B. That's the XLR microphone that the big names might tend to use. I would not recommend jumping right to that microphone for most podcasters. I think the Blue Yeti is a great choice, and there are many other great choices as well, and you can always treat yourself to an upgrade as you grow. By the way, I have a full list of all of these mics and my favorite podcasting tools in my complete podcasting toolkit, which you can download for free at witandwire.com/podcast toolkit. And I'll include a link in the description so you can check out my favorite mics, software, and tools all in one place. One more piece of equipment that we have to talk about is called a pop filter. I definitely recommend having one, especially with the Blue Yeti, because it cuts down on the popping P noises you might hear without one. Those sounds, they're called plosives, and depending on your microphone, you'll either want a pop filter or a windscreen. This is called a windscreen. And so these run about like $10 to $20, and I think it is well worth it. Before we talk about recording and editing tools, there's a lot of debate online about dynamic versus condenser microphones, and I've tested both. I've had students love and use both options, and I think it really comes down to how the microphone sounds in your own space. We underestimate how much your environment matters when it comes to recording, but it really does make a huge difference to choose the right place to record, ideally a quiet space with soft things like carpet or not near a glass window. So again, you'll find links to my favorite mics in the description below this video, but really I recommend testing it out where you'll be recording to see what sounds best to you. Step 4, prep and record episodes. This is the most important part of podcasting, and hopefully it's also the most exciting, creative, and rewarding. And I know everyone likes to talk about microphones, and obviously, same. But while the right tech is crucial and bad sound quality will turn new listeners away, it takes a lot more than just great audio to create true fans. You also have to share value. And no matter what genre your podcast is in, here are some tips to help you create great content. First, you need a clear, relevant topic per episode. Clear means the whole episode is focused, and relevant means it's relevant to your listener. Now, if you're interviewing someone, it's possible and pretty common that you would talk about a lot of different things. But odds are good there's kind of an overarching theme of most of the episode, right? So I usually like to think of an episode title or an objective before I go into any recording, whether it's solo or with a guest, and I'll ask myself, what is my listener getting from this? I'll write down one sentence, maybe two. It doesn't have to be like a tangible tip or a skill. It could be the feeling of not being alone or being entertained by a story, but there should be some kind of value for your listeners. From there, you'll want to have an organized structure, which I call your episode flow. The most common episode flow has an intro, then content, and ends with an outro. Your intro is typically set to theme music, and you can find a list of my favorite places to find royalty-free music in that podcasting toolkit in the description below. Or again, the URL is witandwire.com/podcast toolkit. Step 5, record episodes. So recording and editing can be done in the same tool, but sometimes you may need more than one. So on the left, we have a screenshot of my favorite recording and editing tool. It's called Hindenburg. That's what it looks like. You can record on your computer, and then you can edit right in the same project. The only thing that Hindenburg cannot do is remote recording. So if you're recording with a remote co-host or a guest, that's where I use the tool on the right called Zencastr. I use the free version, and Zencastr can capture that audio from me and from the guests no matter where they are. And then what I do is I download the Zencastr files and edit in Hindenburg. That's the combination I've used for years, but if you want something totally different, then there's another tutorial I have on my YouTube channel about a tool called Descript, which has a totally different approach where you can record your audio and then it will transcribe it on the screen, and you edit audio by actually deleting words on the page. So I like to share these options because I think they suit different styles. There's not one that's better or worse. Audacity is another free option that a lot of people use. But I think overall, if you're recording by yourself, I would recommend Hindenburg only or Descript. And if you have remote guests, I would recommend recording in Zencastr and then downloading it to record in one of those two other tools. Step 6 is editing. I have to say this first. I do not believe that people need you to sound like a robot or to sound perfect in the editing process. I usually leave in ums, ahs, or stutters. If they're really long, like if there's a huge pause and then an I would take it out. But when I was teaching live workshops here at General Assembly in New York, when you are in person, you naturally stutter a little bit. And I didn't think that ever detracted from the students' learning experience. And I think the same is true of a podcast. So I wouldn't feel so stressed about, being so perfect and sounding like a robot. People will like you because you sound like a human. The parts of the editing process that I would focus on are minimizing long pauses and then just kind of cleaning up the audio, editing out any parts where you've made a mistake. And then over time, you may develop your own editing style. The best tip I was ever given by a fellow editing friend was, if a listener won't miss it, it shouldn't be there. So there's one tip for you to take away today. Step 7 is create your RSS feed. Once you've prepared a few episodes and you're ready to launch, you'll need to get one-time approval for your podcast to appear in Apple, Spotify, and each major app. To do that, you'll need a few key things finished. First, your podcast needs a name. Second, you'll need a description. Third, you'll need podcast artwork. And fourth, you'll need at least one episode. But the thing is, you don't just submit that info directly to Apple or directly to Spotify. Instead, you need to put all of that information into what's called an RSS feed. And stick with me, I know this is where it gets technical, but the best analogy I can offer is to think of your RSS feed as a folder. What you need is a tool that when you say, here's my episode, here's the title of the episode, and give it all the info, it'll put all that information into the folder, the RSS feed. And then you're gonna give that feed to Apple one time. And once you're approved, then in the future, anytime you put more information into your RSS feed, AKA your folder, then all that info will appear in Apple, in Spotify, and all of those different apps. So you don't need to individually submit episodes to Apple, to Spotify, to Google. That's not how it works. Instead, all you need is one central tool that creates your RSS feed. And that tool is called a podcast hosting platform. In the complete podcasting toolkit that's linked below this video, you will find my favorite options, including some free gift cards and other perks if you do use my partner links. But I will say that the two that I currently like are Buzzsprout and Captivate. The reason I like these two platforms is, first of all, the analytics are great. Second of all, they're very easy to use. Third, they have very helpful support. And fourth, I have found that they are on the cutting edge of features looking forward into the future of podcasting. As just one example, dynamic content insertion is going to be a huge trend in podcasting over the next few years, and these two tools are both already thinking about options for their users. Not every podcast hosting platform is doing that. So I believe that they are the best price at the best value with sincerely the best tool for most podcast hosts. And maybe one key difference is that in Buzzsprout, you pay per podcast, while in Captivate, you can have unlimited podcasts. So if you know that you want to have more than one show, I would definitely recommend Captivate, but I think it's always just up to you to choose the one you like best. Again, you'll find links below this video to both. To briefly take you behind the scenes and to show you how friendly these tools are, here is a clip of me creating a new episode in Buzzsprout. You can see that it's as easy as dragging and dropping in your audio file, your episode, giving it a title and a description, and then choosing a few other key pieces of info like the scheduled date. The same is true in this demo of me uploading an episode into Captivate. They are very similar. If you can fill out a form, you can create a podcast episode. So although these demos were brief, hopefully they gave you some peace of mind that these tools are friendlier than they may appear. The other crucial thing that a hosting platform does for you is it centralizes your analytics. Imagine people are listening in Spotify, in Apple, so it would be a real pain if you had to go individually to dashboards to see how many people are listening in those different places. But in any good podcast hosting platform, you can see how many total downloads you have across all of the different apps to see how your show is growing over time and to really analyze which episodes are working and what you can try to do more of in the future. Step 8 is launch your podcast. Now, by this point, you will be ready to launch your podcast. And remember, we're thinking very big picture, right? We've got your concept, you've recorded some episodes, you have submitted and created your RSS feed. So now your podcast has been approved by Apple and Spotify, and Google and Amazon. I would say those are the big four. The other apps are all optional, but a lot of them just show all of the apps you see in Apple. So at this point, I want to talk a little bit about launch strategy. Typically about 1 week before, I would recommend that you share your trailer with your audience to build a little bit of excitement. And then on your launch day, I would recommend at least 2 episodes. Some experts say 2 to 5, some even more, but I think that 2, maybe 3 is the sweet spot because it's the Netflix effect. People find content and they want to binge. So especially because you're new, you want to give people a few different options to really start in on your podcast and get hooked. I also think that when you do 2 episodes, you can have a first episode that's a little bit more of an intro so people can learn about you. And then episode 2 feels more like a standard episode. And so that's my typical recommendation. After your launch day, it's up to you how often you want to release episodes. Weekly or every other week, I think, are the most common options. Monthly, it's harder to build up a following, but know yourself best. You can always change your cadence later. I also want to talk about getting podcasting routines into place because they will save you a ton of time. And without those kinds of time-saving processes like templates or scripts or even learning how to batch work and do different work of the same kind at once, that's why a lot of podcast hosts tend to pod fade because they haven't thought about what they would do after launch day. They've been so focused just on getting to day 1. And I think that the other benefit of templates and checklists are the fact that you can keep your sanity and you don't miss those small details that could cost you listeners along the way. So it is not a good use of your very valuable time to start every single episode from scratch, but I think the good news is that podcasting is very repeatable. There are certain steps that you do every single time. So creating systems and simple, repeatable processes are definitely a tip I would recommend for hosts. Another tip I would definitely offer is to create a few extra episodes before you launch. So many people are just counting down until launch day, which is so exciting. But even if you just took 1 or 2 extra weeks to record and edit another episode or 2, then you won't feel immediately like you're on this hamster wheel of production. And I think that gives you a huge advantage as a new podcast host. Now, when it comes to finding listeners, here is bonus tip number 1. Know the difference between owned and earned media. One of the biggest mistakes I see a lot of new hosts and frankly online business owners making is that they only focus on marketing channels that are called owned channels. These are places where you have a profile, things like your website, any social media accounts, your email list, even your podcast. Those are all owned media channels. And that's where most of us focus our time. And too often I see podcast hosts only focusing on Instagram as a way to build their show. The problem is that most of the time, those are people who already know about you. But in order to grow, you need to put yourself in front of new audiences. And that's where earned marketing channels come in. An earned channel is where you get to be in front of somebody else's audience. If you write a guest blog post, if you are a guest on someone else's show, if you speak at a virtual summit, these are just 3 of many ways where you could put yourself in front of new people who can then come back to your Instagram and come back to your podcast and become fans in your world. So my best tip is to make sure that you do have a mix of at least one earned media strategy, even if you're not doing it right from episode 1, but just know that that's really going to be the way to grow over time. That said, I know that Instagram is still a great marketing channel for podcasters. So I do have another YouTube video that you'll find here where I share my top Instagram strategies for podcasters. Bonus tip number 2 is about monetization, because there's a huge myth that sponsorship is the most lucrative way to earn money as a podcast host, but in fact, it's just the most well-known strategy. I did a whole other video on how to earn money as a podcaster, and I would definitely recommend it, especially if you're an online business owner, because the truth is that sponsorship is one of the least profitable ways to earn money as a podcast host. So I will leave a link to that video above and also in the description below this video so that you can learn more about your options. If you're thinking about launching a new podcast, I do have a full program called the Podcast Launch Accelerator, where I help new hosts go from idea to published podcast in Apple and Spotify and your first 1,000 listens. These are just some of the students who have really had success in the program I absolutely love to teach, and you can learn more at witandwire.com/courses, or you'll find a link below. Since you're interested in podcasting and because I just mentioned it, here is the next video I would recommend for you, all about monetizing a podcast.